So I would reframe the question a little bit. So when OPEC cut, when they did that 2 million cut, it's actually technically not a production cut. It's a cut for the ceiling for how much they can produce. And what's interesting is they were already they were already missing and underperforming that ceiling. And if you go back to OPEC historically, it's actually been the problem of the other way around. Like they set a ceiling and then countries are kind of going over it, trying to, sell a little extra around the margins, kind of cheating a little bit. And so it's actually a matter of forcing, not going above it. Whereas in this environment, there's been the opposite, where the majority of OPEC countries or a bunch of OPEC countries are failing to even meet their ceiling. And there's been good research by a number of firms that specialize in energy, kind of all out more than I do, and they've done like the detailed work on analyzing some of these countries, and they've argued that a lot of these are near capacity. That that with the current level of capex and sometimes in some cases just the amount of reserves they have and just overall kind of maximum output they can do, that they're kind of tapped out. There's a little bit around the margins maybe, but they don't have this gigantic swing production that many people think they do, which is different than history. And then they might have to trim the production ceiling. If you keep failing to meet your production targets, eventually countries realize you don't have what you say you have. And so this is, I think one way of managing the optics. There's also the question, because we're talking about OPEC plus, which includes Russia. Due to the war, the Western oil companies have had to pull out. They had capital and equipment and expertise that was part of Russia's production. And so the question is, we talked about oil declines, what happens in a year, 2 years, 3 years, if they can't recoup that level of investment to keep that production as high or higher than it is now. You could see a mild fall off in Russian production, for example. And so I think it's actually more a matter of OPEC not fully having the ability to keep amping it up. Then there's also a matter of geopolitical alliances, deteriorating conditions between U.S. and Saudi relations. And so essentially what that is saying, though, is that there is a floor there. They're willing to defend that floor, but also that they might not just have a lot of spare capacity. And, there are ways, North America and Europe do have oil and gas reserves that you can tap into. I know in Europe, they've run into some earthquakes. So, some of these things, and sometimes there's environmental groups that say we don't want to tap into this. In the United States, Biden has issued an order of magnitude fewer drilling permits for federal lands within the first 19 months of his administration compared to any post-World War II administration. And that's part of his campaign program. He didn't want drilling on federal lands. It was prior to an acute energy crisis. And so now you have that dichotomy between, you made a promise, but then you want to get inflation under control. Then there's that. There's also a matter of there's only so much refining and transportation capacity, right? So in the United States, you have pretty cheap natural gas. The question is, why can't we just send that all over to Europe? And of course, the problem is you need LNG infrastructure, which is expensive and time consuming to build. And then even if we get it there, then you need import LNG infrastructure, and then you need to have then the transportation to get that from the coast to the points where you need it. And so it's a matter of that type of infrastructure. It's a matter of refining. So you can have all the oil you want, but if you only have so much diesel production capacity, you can have a diesel shortage, even if oil's cheap, right? So there's multiple parts, there's multiple bottlenecks along the path to get right. So one thing that North American or Europe, like Western countries can do, one is they could expand their exploration and production around the margins. They also can invest in more infrastructure, transportation, refining, things like that. In the United States, we've not added a new refinery in like 50 years. We've expanded existing refineries, and that's because, they're not the most environmentally friendly sites. And there's always opposition, not in my backyard, no more refineries. And it's like, well, there is a trade-off for that. Either you have to import more of that product, or you're going to have shortages and high prices of that product if demand does not fall off with your capped or slow growing supply. And so there are investments that can be done. And I think it's one of those things where when the price signals emerge immediately, maybe there's the idea that it's transitory, or, you can blame someone. But if it goes on month after month, quarter after quarter, year after year, eventually that starts to change how people vote. It changes how politicians run the numbers. They want to stay in power. That changes how companies will choose to invest longer term capital. And they say, okay, this shortage is here to stay. Maybe a little bit more aggressive here now. And so, price eventually can solve a lot of things. And it just takes time, and it takes working through some of the headwinds that are present at the current time. Yeah, there's been, both in the United States and in Europe, there's a problem with construction in general. It's just, there's a lot of headwinds for doing it. And like you pointed out, there's not a lot of incentive to, run on a campaign of stronger grids unless you're experiencing like rolling blackouts, right? So once the problem has to get severe before it becomes a voter issue, and at that point it takes years to fix, right? So that's just how that works. And like the funny stat that we have is, the United States, it took like a year to build the Empire State Building in the 30s. We can't build a skyscraper in a year now. We can barely build one in 5 years. If you try to build like high-speed rail, good luck. Give it a decade, you'll still have like the permitting being done. It's just a lot of countries are now, it's very challenging to build these infrastructure projects, and that includes modernizing the grid, right? So a lot of these goals, they want to electrify things more. Right now you can call it almost decentralized energy. So you have let's say my house has electrical power, it also has a natural gas line, and then also my car goes to a gasoline, which is a whole nother distribution point, right? So all there's 3 different energy distribution points that are basically going to my home and my consumption. And the idea is, if we want to fold that all into just electricity, right? So instead of using natural gas for my heating or my stove, a lot of communities are saying only electric now. So that gets forwarded into the electric power. And then they say, okay, now we want to do EVs, only electric vehicles. And so that whole like gasoline, transport infrastructure, that gets forwarded into the grid, right? And so then suddenly, instead of 3 different channels of energy, I'm relying on 1 channel of energy. Well, that better be a super robust type of energy, or energy transportation, electricity, because if it's not ready for that, or if it goes down, everything goes down, instead of having 3 different types of energy. And so that's I think the challenge with this long-term plan of electrification, and also the ability, even outside of energy, the ability for kind of wealthy developed countries that already have a lot of infrastructure to build and replace that existing infrastructure. It's just a very costly, very bureaucratic, very, very challenging thing to do for a variety of reasons. If you cause a deep enough recession and suppress demand enough, if enough businesses shut down due to high energy costs, if you create enough unemployment to suppress wage increases, then you can cure inflation, but it's like cutting off your leg to fix the infection, right? It's like that's not what the patient asked for. What people really kind of mean when they say that, or like I think that what they should mean is, how can you get back to a period of disinflationary growth? And I think that's only possible once you fix the energy situation. And even then, there's some pressures. There's we had a multi-decade trend of globalization towards places like China, and that's stalling out, or in some cases reversing, just due to, one is demographics, and we've already filled that bucket now. And also there's of course geopolitical tensions and reasons and things like that. So I think the short answer is I've been describing like holding a beach ball underwater. You can temporarily hold it down. You can drain the strategic petroleum reserve. You can, China's doing recurring lockdowns, which is actually suppressing quite a bit of fuel demand. You can do, you can tighten monetary policy so much that no one's building homes, and electricity prices can get out of control and shut down fertilizer and metals companies. And you can kind of press that down by having demand kind of fall to meet supply. The problem is then you start to get recession, you start to get unrest. And if you then try to stimulate you out of that, well, those shortages are still there structurally if you have not taken that time to increase supply. And another challenging thing is that all these rate hike increases, admirable as they are, they increase the cost of capital for energy companies. And so the hurdle rate for them choosing to do a new project is even higher now. And so it's suppressing demand, but it's also suppressing, in some cases, supply, arguably. And so we're in an environment where until we grind through this, until we actually fix the energy situation, I don't think you're going to get disinflationary growth, kind of bouncing between either you're going to get inflation or you're going to get recessionary-like conditions with, maybe lower inflation